Hi, I'm Maarten Smith and I'm presenting the paper Scaffolding Shared Imagination with Tangible Design on behalf of Sander van der Zwan, Jelle Bruineberg, Pierre Lévy and Caroline Hummels. Maybe it's helpful to begin by contextualizing the paper in the broader line of research that we're carrying out, which is into a design philosophy correspondence. In a design philosophy correspondence, the practices of philosophy and design come together, build upon each other, and inform each other. We're doing this research at the Transformative Practices Squad, which is part of the Faculty of Industrial Design at the Eindhoven University of Technology. In this paper, we use ecological and enactive philosophical ideas and a concrete design project to argue for and illustrate imaginative affordances. Before going into the details of this, it's helpful to understand the theoretical backdrop against which the research takes place. Now, design research and practice, and in particular the Thai community, have been successful in promoting skilled, embodied, unreflective coping over a reflective and detached approach to everyday activities. This is characterized by, for example, efforts to reduce semantic pollution. These efforts resonate with ecological and enactive approaches to cognition, which form part of the theoretical backbone of the community. Now, traditionally, these approaches have been able to deal well with many of our practical everyday activities, in particular what others have categorized as lower cognitive abilities, such as interactions with daily tools, like riding a bike or using a knife and fork. However, it's also often claimed that these approaches fall short when employed to account for higher cognitive abilities, such as imagination or remembering or reflecting. Now, in response to this, recent movements in ecological and enactive philosophy have shown that many of such higher cognitive activities can also be regarded as shared and embodied. To understand this response in a little more detail, let's take a look at the notion of affordances and how ecological and enactive philosophy scale affordances up. The term affordance was first coined by James Gibson, who defined it as action possibilities provided by an environment to an organism. It was then picked up on and altered by different practices like design research and philosophy and psychology. From an ecological and enactive perspective, affordances have a much broader application than just motor possibilities. In short, they are relative to a form of life, so not dependent on an individual. They are also skill dependent, so they can be learnt, and they can be perceived as relevant or not. In order to get a better understanding of how designing for imagination can be approached from an ecological and enactive perspective, we analyzed a concrete design project titled Expedition RVS 2050. In this project, Rijkswaterstaat, which is the executive agency of the Dutch Ministry for Infrastructure and Water Management, aims to imagine a range of possible futures so that it's better prepared to anticipate and deal with the changing situation in the Netherlands. As part of this project, they invited our team to use our design research skills and engage in discussions with a cross-section of the Dutch population. In doing so, we would imagine together with them what the future could possibly look like and what it would mean for them. To facilitate these imaginative discussions, we wrote 7 short speculative stories and designed a set of physical discussion tools. Rijkswaterstaat requested that we base the discussions on a collection of demographic, economic, political, sociocultural, and technological trends. We embedded these abstract third-person trends into stories of everyday life that participants could relate to, and presented them as audiobooks with accompanying imagery. Next to this, we provided a playing field and a collection of diverse objects, some recognizable, such as wooden figurines, and others more abstract. Throughout the discussions that followed, the interviewers traced the conversation by placing physical objects and post-its on the table. The stories sketched a possible future world, but they were written to leave a lot of space open for the participants' imagination to work from. Features and characters from the stories were placed in the playing field and provided a foothold for the participants to imagine themselves in the possible future. During the sessions, the traces formed on the playing field afforded a number of actions. Among others, they afforded including or excluding relations from the imagined world by placing objects inside or outside the boundaries of the playing field. They afforded summarizing things that were previously talked about by pointing at the field. They afforded remembering parts of the conversation by looking at the field, and in doing so provided the possibility to propose alternatives by rearranging, removing and adding objects. They afforded the interviewers to interpret what had been said by tracing the conversation with the objects, while in turn affording participants to correct misunderstandings. The material and social setting provided the opportunity to relate to the story and maintain a common ground. Now, we haven't done a comparative study between the kind of imagining that was scaffolded by our final design and the kind that would have been scaffolded by handing participants the original trends that we started with. Whether abstract trends afford imagining might also be a matter of skill. It might be the case for an engineer at Rijkswaterstaat, but not for the average Dutch citizen. At any rate, given the preceding analysis, we think it's plausible to say that the stories, the social setting, and the discussion tools tapped into our embodied potential for meaning making in a way that the abstract trends alone would not have been able to do, or at least not for average Dutch citizens. Our goal with this paper was to show that arranging the social setting and designing the tools has an influence on the kind of imaginative process that can unfold. The 3 examples detailed in the paper help to concretize this view. The participants are not first imagining a future world in their heads and then building this world from the objects at the table. Rather, relations made by tracing the conversation and assigning meaning to objects and the way that other participants act in the process become affordances for further imagination. In other words, the imagined future world unfolds in the shared placing, replacing, moving, taking away, and talking about the artifacts on the table. Imagination, from this perspective, can be regarded as a shared and scaffolded activity. Guided by recent developments in ecological and active philosophy, we started from the assumption that many of our intellectual activities are concrete, situated, and scaffolded by our social material environment. Reflection and engagement are not orthogonal activities, they are rather interdependent. In this instance, the activity of imagination was done by pointing, negotiating, talking, probing, and reflecting. Imagination in these examples is in the enactment of affordances. It's in the doing. As Sean Gallagher puts it, in this respect, the imaginative practice is to manipulate concepts, thoughts, images, take them up and play with them, move them around in order to solve a problem, or map them onto novel affordance spaces. The imaginative practice is a social, material, and therefore tangible practice in which design can take part.